morning, good afternoon. I am Zsuzsa Cserg, Director of Virtual vASN and Professor of Political Studies at Queen's University, Canada. I'm here to welcome everyone to the first event in 2025 in our webinar series. And we are focusing on nationalism and migration, two defining themes of our time, which are often in tension. And today's panel, organized and moderated by Harris Mylonas, features perspectives from two leading scholars in the field who have agreed to bring their expertise to the vASN community and explore this complex relationship from their perspectives. I am going to turn over the virtual floor to Harris Mylonas, who doesn't need much introduction. And our practice here is that we are posting short bios in the chat. I'm just going to say that Harris is one of the most talented, amazing scholar in the field of nationalism studies. He and I have worked together on many different things. He is, among other things, editor-in-chief of Nationalism Studies, author, editor of major books, also published in all kinds of venues, from top journals in the field to policy journals. He's now also starting or has started a podcast, so he's prolific. He has a documentary film. So I give you Harris Mylonas, who is going to introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. I will be in the background, and toward the very end, I will come back to thank everyone again. And let's have a little bit of fun at this in this January day after January 20th that has brought quite a bit of change in Washington, D.C. So, Harris, take it over.
Thank you for this unnecessarily nice introduction, but I'll take it. I'm here primarily to facilitate the discussion featuring Sara Goodman and Stephanie Zonszein. But I will be chiming in here and there, given that the fact that I've done some work, not a lot of work on this field that we're discussing today, nationalism and immigrant integration in particular. But I've worked quite a bit on nationalism, and as an editor-in-chief of Nationalities papers, I've been overseeing some work on that front. But we have decided to start with Sara first, with Sara Goodman, professor at University of California, Irvine. And we're then going to move to Stephanie later, and that is for, it will become obvious why, because of the nature of what they're going to talk about. And then we're going to open up for a Q&A. So, Sara, the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Thank you. I apologize ahead of time. We adopted a dog on Sunday, and she is sort of whining over there in the corner, but I wanted to stay home with her today, so I'll do my best. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm really happy to have this discussion. It's sort of been kind of something I've been itching to do since I met Harris like a decade ago, maybe more. I won't betray our ages. And because we study kind of similar things, but in different buildings, so to speak. And the conversation between nationalism and immigrant integration, right, sort of they necessarily dovetail, but in ways that I think are kind of unobvious, or in ways that we don't kind of structure them in the discipline. So kind of the way I think about immigrant integration is like, it's just kind of a form of external nationalism. So like, what do I mean by that? So if we think about nationalism as, you know, on the one hand, we kind of have these extreme nationalism, right? The kind of nationalism we see from nationalists, like the nativism, the populist rhetoric that we hear like from Hungary to the AfD in Germany to the 47th president of the United States. You know, verbiage about our land, our people, right? So on the one end, you have this kind of extreme nationalism. And on the other hand, as I'm sure everybody knows, but in case you're using this as a resource in your classroom, you have this kind of banal nationalism, right? The idea ours and us is apparent, but it's sort of part of the quotidian everyday experience of being a citizen, right? You have flags as decorations, or you have the national anthem. But like both extreme and banal versions are kind of tools, right, for mobilizing national sentiment, for supporting the government, etc. Like, immigrants don't inherently fit into that story because they're not citizens, right? They're outsiders, and nationalism is about us and our story. But like there are people that try to join that group, and there are people part of that process of joining that national story, right? Of obtaining nationality. So how do we think about this intersection? That's where citizenship sits, like at that intersection of outsiders becoming insiders. And there's all these processes that are extremely active to facilitate that process. So on the one hand, it's kind of extreme. If we think about its application, right, it could be very rigorous, very restrictive, lots of requirements, lots of hoops to jump through. And on the other hand, it's really invisible to everyday citizens, right? So just as we don't think about our citizenship every day, our obligations, our duties, our status, we also really don't think about the process of becoming a citizen, except when it's in the national news. It's sort of an occupational hazard of political scientists to be relevant to the news. But the idea that we could sort of start to have a national conversation about what it means to be born in the United States, and whether that is a mechanism of integration, and whether that is a marker of national belonging, kind of shows both the importance and the value of national membership. And so immigrant integration is very much a part of the nationalism story, and it's sort of active, right? It is an area of active policymaking in immigrant receiving countries. So in my research, I've done a lot of work on nationalism, on citizenship, and the national content of citizenship. So that's kind of the angle in which I'm coming at this question. So as I've written on it, my specific area of interest are the requirements that immigrants need to complete when it comes to the content of belonging. So specifically, like, what does it mean to be a national insider? We're asking states to essentially put on paper what it means to belong, what they think it means to be an American, what they think it means to be British or German, etc. And so I look at programs like civic orientation classes. I look at language requirements, language classes, language tests, oath ceremonies, pledges that they make to the liberal democratic values of the state, etc. And so when we look at it from that perspective, right, these are the things that immigrants do to become insiders. When we look at it from the state perspective, this is what the state is saying it means to belong. And if you meet these requirements, we give you the legal recognition of belonging. We give you the status of citizenship, and in our nation-state model, citizenship is a marker of national belonging. So what are these requirements? This was the subject of my first book, Immigration and Membership Politics in Western Europe. So I studied from the perspective of Western Europe, where these policies were being actively created in the mid-2000s and are still being actively created today, and made more restrictive sort of as time goes on. And so kind of one of the really interesting things from a comparative perspective is not just to study why these policies are made and how difficult states make them, but who they're learning from. And when I was a young and sprightly graduate student hopping about Western Europe, doing interviews with policymakers, they would always tell me that I was like the follow-up delegation to the Americans, who were also going round and round to European countries, studying how they were adopting integration practices. And you might think like, well, no, that's the reverse process, because the US has had immigration, naturalization oath ceremonies for a while and a test since the 1980s, right? But they were having conversations with each other, learning processes to implement and change these integration programs. The Americans were learning from the Belgians were learning from the Americans, back and forth. And so then I was coming along and asking all these questions about why they're adopting these policies. And it required the policymakers, most of them in the Home Office, which we think of as the State Department, right, which is where the sort of immigration used to take place before we created the Department for Homeland Security. They were sort of all wedded to this idea of kind of making robust integration policies to make outsiders into insiders, learning our national values, learning our culture, history, heritage, etc. But sort of specifically our liberal democratic values. That was sort of the linchpin, what David Cameron would later refer to as a muscular liberalism, which I think implies it can like bench press 100 pounds or more. I don't know. So we learned that these integration courses, so it's just one of many ways to integrate individuals. It's just the one that I study, but there's also like job training and employment, what's it called? Like employment placement programs, language programs. There's sort of all these policy mechanisms that states have at their disposal to make outsiders into insiders. And they teach all different kinds of content. So that to me was one of the really interesting parts. Like, how do states define their national identity? What does it mean, right? And so you had a lot of variation across these civic orientation classes, right? Where, for instance, like in Austria, you would have like, constitution and the law, you'd have education, employment, like this very sort of wide definition, history, culture, whereas in like, I'm thinking of an example where you wouldn't have, so in Norway, for instance, you would not have culture and traditions. They decided specifically customs and traditions is not part of integration programming. History, services, employment, education, constitution, all that stuff is. So it was always interesting to see when states would include customs and history, customs and traditions, and when they wouldn't, right? So we see sort of where the boundaries of national belonging were being negotiated. And so, immigrants would participate in these civic orientation classes. They'd have to pass a language test at a certain level. And then if successful in both endeavors, then they would take a naturalization oath and become an insider. And so the question then is, so you study these programs, you study why they're made. I have a project where I, interview people who have completed these programs to ask from their perspective whether they worked or not. But then the final question is, what do they do? What do they produce? So there's a ton of empirical research that uses administrative data that studies sort of immigrants, specifically refugees in a lot of cases, from like the time they start a program till time after they finish the program. And like almost every study shows that these courses, these introduction programs, these language and civic orientation classes, they improve employment, they improve earnings, they improve language, of course, right? You take a language class, your language proficiency is going to be better. But by the end, what we still don't know, so we have all these great economic outcomes, linguistic proficiency. There's some things that we still don't know. Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they have socially integrated, like they have friends outside of their group networks? So in one of the projects that I did in Norway, we find that people are really appreciative of this program, right? They're paid to attend. They receive a stipend to attend that even includes holiday. They're appreciative of the opportunity, especially to compensate for learning loss that they may have obtained by missing school, by living in a refugee camp, or have never gone to school in their country of origin due to conflict or culture. But that in the at the end, so they appreciate this program, but they also express frustration, right? That they can't continue in the program, right? They can't extend their educational opportunities, or they're filtered into the labor market, into jobs where they cannot work on their linguistic integration further, or they cannot obtain a different kind of job, one that matches their previous skill set. So there's some frustration involved in the program. So from the immigrant perspective, maybe they meet the bar for citizenship, obtain citizenship, maybe they don't, and that's another source of frustration. There's still a lot to learn about their experiences in the integration programs, and a lot to learn about whether they can overcome some of those belonging barriers that Kristen Simonson, for example, documents with regard to immigrants in Denmark, even second generation individuals born to immigrant parents who have Danish citizenship who express outsider status or a failure to feel like they belong to the national political community. The last part of it is, do citizens consider them successful insiders? This is the thing I really wanted to know. They do all the things. They naturalize, they make natural, right? Let's look at the Latin root word. Do native born or ordinary citizens consider them good citizens? So I have this recent paper in, I can pull up the citation, the citation, it's called, long title. Who is a good citizen? Evidence from a chondroid experiment in 3 democracies. It's in a Political Research Quarterly. And so I wanted to know, can immigrants like overcome their immigrant heritage, lack of nativity, right? By naturalizing and doing the other obligations of good citizenship? This was we have a lot of research about who should get citizenship, but I wanted to know, like, once you have citizenship, are you sort of treated equally? Can you overcome the immigrant bias that may be attached to, or the heritage bias that may be attached to your identity? And we find that, like, immigrants, when evaluated alongside other attributes, can be considered good citizens. There's a slight kind of nativity bias that remains in the US, in the UK, and in Germany. But what was particularly interesting to me, and in the context of the current political, what is the right word to describe the current political situation? Upheaval, uncertainty, challenge to birthright citizenship. I guess I'll leave it there. We see a real difference when we subset by partisanship. So when we look at questions of who is a good citizen, Republicans are far more likely to consider native-born citizens good citizens, even if they are also Christian, have money to support themselves, have politically diverse friend groups, are politically informed, and vote. The nativity bias remains. This is not the case for Democrats. So that was a particularly kind of worrying finding, but one that echoes the political context in which we're living in. So national identity remains extremely important, and a fundamental part of understanding immigrant integration and citizenship today, and unfortunately, like, remains particularly politically relevant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. You covered a lot of ground. I've posted the links of your book and this particular article for everybody in the chat, and we're gonna make these available online on our website, nationalities.org, where we host afterwards all these videos and these resources for students or scholars. So we'll definitely come back. If you have questions already from the many things that were heard from Sara, you can start using the Q&A function in the Zoom, I guess, interface. And then without further ado, I'm going to move on. And as we said, the bios that are long of both Sara and Stephanie are going to be in the chat. So I'm just going to say that Stephanie is joining us from UC Berkeley. There's a lot of representation from California on this on this virtual panel, perhaps appropriately given the topic. But without further ado, Stephanie is going to talk about some more specific work that relates to some of the things that Sara discussed. But then we're going to open it up to a broader discussion. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Harris, for the introduction, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to talk about 2 things. First, about the role of multiculturalist policies on immigrant integration, and more specifically about the role of government-supported ethnic media on the political engagement of ethnic minority immigrants. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the consequences of immigrant successful integration for politics and intergroup relations. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the responses of dominant group members to the accession of ethnic minority immigrants to public office. So let's start with multiculturalist policies. These are policies that recognize and support the cultural diversity of a country. How? By accommodating cultural diversity in common institutions. For example, think of establishing publicly funded bilingual schools, support for ethnic media and other ethnic community organizations, providing spaces for religious practices, or by promoting representation of minority groups in government and public institutions. And so these types of multiculturalist policies are often accompanied by the civic integration programs that Sara just talked about. And so overall, this package of policies that I talk about them as multiculturalist policies tend to protect the rights of ethnic and cultural groups to maintain their distinct identities while they are able to participate in their country's society. And so they pair, on the one hand, maintaining links and attachment to culture of origin, and on the other hand, they use these types of civic integration programs that Sara just talked about to manage the capabilities of immigrants of starting to integrate into the norms and the practices of their new countries. And so among scholars and also policymakers, there is this big unsettled debate. It's a debate that started in the 1990s. So it's an old debate, but it's still unsettled about how to incorporate immigrants into their new countries. And so on one side of this debate, you have the multiculturalists. These are people who claim that minority communities will be more attached to broader society and the institutions of their new countries when they are specifically accommodated in the ways that I've already mentioned. So for example, again, think of support for bilingual schools or ethnic community organizations and so on. And so this side of the debate can be represented, for example, by the work of political philosophers like Wilkie Mlika or Charles Taylor, and of sociologists like Irene Bloombrad. On the opposite side of this debate, you have the proponents of cultural monism. These are people who claim that the structural assimilation of immigrants, for example, the fact that immigrants can access jobs and send their children to schools and learn a new language and find housing and so on, is only possible with their cultural assimilation. So these forms of structural assimilations are only possible if they detach from their culture of origin, from their identity of origin. And so these cultural monists assert that institutions that only serve a specific cultural group can promote segregation and even can promote the radicalization of accommodated groups, harming, of course, immigrant integration, but more broadly, social cohesion. And so on the side of this side of the debate, you can find scholars, political sociologists like Christian Jobke, for example, or even we can talk about the work of Ruth Goodman as fitting on this side of the other debate. And so to contribute to this unsettled debate about how to best incorporate immigrants, my work centers on the role of a specific UK policy, allowing and supporting the licensing of ethnic radio on the political incorporation of ethnic minority immigrants. So why ethnic radio? So how does the ethnic media support the political incorporation of immigrants? Well, there's different explanations to this. The ethnic media, on the one hand, removes linguistic barriers, right, to access political information. And relative to the mainstream media, it covers more procedural information. So for example, how to turn out to vote, how to access services from local government, how to connect with community members and so on. And so this type of information decreases the costs of accessing political information and the cost of deciding who to vote for and therefore of turning out to vote. Moreover, by covering issues that are relevant to immigrants, for example, think about border issues or anti-immigrant crimes, this media increases immigrants' exposure to political information, encouraging their interest in politics or attracting them into learning things, specifically political content about their new countries. And so the ethnic media can also increase immigrant representation in state institutions. How? On the one hand, it might establish a more positive discourse that enables a climate whereby immigrants can bring their claims. And so it enables this climate where immigrants feel more self-assured of making claims to local government and to broader society. And also it promotes the community's civic visibility, of course, among local politicians, but also among the larger society around these spaces. And both of these things would contribute to the inclusion of immigrant demands in the political agenda, promoting their political participation and representation. And so to assess the role of this UK policy supporting ethnic radio, what I do is that I gather data from public opinion surveys of immigrants, administrative data on turnout, and data on the geographic coverage of these ethnic radio stations. And I then compare the post-policy change in electoral participation of ethnic minority immigrants who are exposed to these radio stations to the change in electoral participation of immigrants who do not have access to these radio stations. And what I find is that access to ethnic radio can increase immigrants' electoral participation and their interest in politics. And so, against the claims of the proponents of cultural monism, against the claims of those who propose that structural assimilation is only viable with cultural assimilation, these findings in this very specific context of this UK policy that funded ethnic media suggest that policies accommodating minority groups in common institutions, again, for example, through language accommodation or by funding increased representation in public institutions, might be necessary for the integration of immigrants into society. So this is one finding. But you might be thinking, and this is what I'm going to cover next, you might be thinking, well, but there is a concern about these multiculturalist policies, and this is particularly a concern among policymakers. The concern is that these type of multiculturalist policies supporting cultural accommodation may provoke backlash among members of dominant groups, possibly affecting intergroup relations, but also the prospects for further immigrant incorporation, and also the political prospects of the supporters of these types of policies. And so this might be especially a concern about policies designed to promote the representation of minority groups in government. And so this concern is also actually not only among policymakers, but it's quite grounded in theories also coming from sociology. So for example, one big theory that could explain this concern or these dynamics is the theory of power threats by Hubert Blalock. This is a theory from the 1960s, which holds that the dominant group will impose punitive sanctions on minorities when it believes the minority group has evolved into a threat to the existing social order, especially when it has increased access to social, political, and economic resources. And so I'm going to focus again on a policy or a dynamic that can speak about this dynamic. And I'm going to try to assess whether there is indeed a backlash from dominant group members and how strong this backlash is. And so I'm going to specifically be looking at an informal arrangement that was created in 2010 by the three biggest parties in the UK, so the Labour Party, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats, who made this informal agreement to increase the representation of ethnic minorities in the UK Parliament. And so as a result of this informal agreement, the share of members of parliament with an ethnic minority background increased from 4% in 2010 to 10% in 2019 to 14% in the past 2024 election, now actually representing the ethnic minority background of the population. And so I take this informal agreement and I take this increase in representation to look at whether having more minority politicians in parliament is generating this expected backlash. And so this is work that I have co-authored with Guy Grossman. And so we're going to use the presence of this informal agreement and the resulting accession of minorities to political office to assess whether this form of multiculturalist policies, I'm saying this form because it's specifically about increasing the representation of minorities in political bodies, provoke backlash from dominant group members. And so what I do is that I look at both social and political responses. So when I think about social responses, I think about increased hate crime against minorities, exclusionary attitudes towards immigrants, even negative media coverage of immigrant groups, and increased electoral participation from the white British, and also increased support for the strongest opponent to the minority candidate who wins this election, in the next election. And so what we're going to do here is that we compare these different social and political responses across constituencies where minority candidates narrowly won. And we compare these constituencies against constituencies that were narrowly won by white candidates. And we're going to compare whether in places where the minority candidate wins, we observe these negative responses relative to places where a white candidate wins. And so the comparison of these very specific areas where these are narrowly won by one candidate or the other is important, because what we can do by focusing this with this very narrow focus is that we can compare places that are very similar to each other in the demographic makeup of their constituencies and other things. So pretty much we can say these places are identical except for their ethnicity of their MP. And so these will allow us to control for many different things that may be generating these type of negative responses. And so we can isolate what is the response specifically to having an ethnic minority representative in power. And so the answer to this question is yes, we do find evidence that is suggestive of a backlash. We find increased hate crime, increased exclusionary attitudes towards immigrants, and increased negative coverage, response in terms of turnout coming from the white British and so on. However, it's important to say that while we do find these backlash responses, which are the concern of policymakers and scholars alike, it's important to say and mention and show and perhaps explain further that this backlash is only short-lived. After pretty much 5 or 6 months after the election, these types of negative responses in terms of crime, negative media coverage, and so on, they start to recede. And so overall, we can say that promoting the representation of minorities in government may therefore have a positive net benefit, right? So it generates backlash. However, this backlash is short-lived. But on the other hand, we know from a lot of research that having more ethnic minority representatives systematically increases the political incorporation of immigrants, but it also increases the participation of immigrants. It stimulates the participation of other minority politicians at other levels of government. So for example, there is research showing that when we have more ethnic minority parliamentarians, these will stimulate participation at the local level and so on for local councils. And so it increases incorporation of immigrants, and it also increases the representation in the policymaking process. And so I guess just to wrap up these different findings and policies that I talked about, I would say that collectively, the findings suggest that some multiculturalist policies, perhaps specifically the ones that I've been focusing on, not only promote the political or civic incorporation of immigrants, but also they are contributing to making liberal democracies perhaps more representative democracies and egalitarian democracies. And so this is all I have planned to say, and I'm happy to take questions in follow-up.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Sara, you can also join now for the Q&A. So a lot of issues have been opening up left and right. There was a lot more actually discussion among you than I expected. So we have the first question. Unless Sara wants to add or respond to some of the things that Stephanie said and vice versa. Was there something that came to your mind that you wanted to? No, okay. So the first question is directed to Sara by Hans Siebers. And I'll summarize basically because it's quite long. The idea is that since you argued that civic integration programs are facilitating migrants to become part of the nation and that such programs improve employment. However, Hans suggests that in his work, he finds that these type of programs may also reify, so to speak, this type of boundaries and have the opposite results. What are your thoughts? I'm summarizing, but you get the gist. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the question. And thank you, Stephanie, for the presentation. I really enjoy your work. So I'm just gonna, I don't want to rephrase your question, but I want to actually completely agree with you. And I think we have the same perspective on this. I don't think that I argued that these programs successfully facilitate in all cases. Certainly not that I have found in my work, in my co-authored work in Norway. The point of these programs, the state objective is to integrate. Whether or not that actually comes to fruition is an empirical question. And there is a lot of empirical work that looks at administrative data that does before and after studies. And by and large, they're showing that there's a sort of one group of work that we can talk about that looks just at ordinary immigrants and another just specifically at refugees, where we would anticipate that there's some variation in how they experience integration programs. But just among ordinary immigrants, because I'm guessing from your question that was the population you're referencing, there's work in Denmark that shows that exposure to these programs improves employment. From Germany, that shows it improves language acquisition. From Sweden, that it improves employment. From Finland, earnings and job quality, the US earnings, right? So all those studies are largely positive. But there's also studies that show vast, I saw David Layton's in here. So he has this, work with, what was it? MRO 2022, right? Largely null effects that exist from some of these exposures, for these program exposures. So, and we don't know, from a study in Norway, political and social consequences, null effects. So there's still a lot to learn, and you're showing us evidence that shows that in the Netherlands, right? That these programs can undermine, integration outcomes. Yeah, because they make things way harder. I mean, you really nail it. And I hope that the discipline has space for methodological pluralism to answer these kinds of questions in the ways that are appropriate to meet immigrants where they're at in terms of speaking to some of these more difficult questions about belonging and social exposure, etc.
Thank you. Sara, you have another one, and then I'll pivot. Jennifer McCoy asks, are there specific conditions for acceptance of immigrants by native-born, such as a demonstration of gratitude, reciprocity, loyalty to nation, as it has been found in Canada, she suggests?
Oh, sorry, I was reading at the same time. Oh, Jennifer, hi. Is that the question you were reading, Harris?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do we know
Yeah.
basically about, or what do you think we know? And Stephanie, feel free to chime in terms of what are the conditions under which natives kind of are more likely to. I mean, I could also chime in if you want some time, in the sense that this kind of brings up why we had nationalism in the beginning of this title, right? There is this thing called varieties of nationalism that at least Maya Tudor and I wrote a short book on. where, you know, these obviously would vary. You suggested, Jennifer, that Canada, you found certain things, but well, if you move to another context where the definition of nationhood or the understanding of nationhood, to use Brubaker's term, may be different, those conditions I suggest and I suspect they would vary, right? That's the nationalism easy cut
Yes.
to this answer, but I don't know how Sara would address that. Yeah.
Absolutely, right? I mean, so I didn't get a chance to include Canada in my PRQ article. I know that, sorry, PSQ. You know, I know that there is a lot of research by Canadians in Canada who are sort of asking similar questions right now. And they, gosh, I'm trying to remember the study. I'll look it up and put it into the chat later. Like, of course, you're going to get variation in that kind of national responses. The extent to which diversity is an explicit message is a part of belonging, I just don't know. I hope that to be true. So like I use proxy of native born and naturalized as an attempt to sort of imply that, but I didn't get the chance to ask it outright. But you know, my study was comparative to include the UK and Germany, and so we do see that, like, on the one hand, right, if you take a sort of the strict liberal constitutionalism view of what national belonging is, like they have sort of similar articulations of belonging, and we still see variation with respect to who's an insider versus who's an outsider. But you know, these narratives are extremely important, and while they may not vary on paper, they certainly vary in practice cross-nationally.
There is a question for Stephanie by Grant Unk, who used to be my student. So here we go. Is the scale and durability of the backlash from dominant majority groups to accommodation policies for immigrants contingent upon the cultural distance between the majority and the immigrant group? For instance, is the backlash bigger for Français de Souche, I guess, natives toward Muslim immigrants relative to white Britons towards Polish immigrants? It's just an example. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a fair question, and I would say ultimately is an empirical question, right? And we did a little bit of this type of analysis in our work, and so we do find that when a minority candidate is not only ethnic minority but also Muslim, we see a greater backlash. We also observe some intersectionality actually with gender, and so there is more backlash to female politicians that stem from an ethnic minority background. And so from these types of analyses, you could perhaps say, okay, yeah, it is suggestive that backlash is different depending on the distance between dominant groups and minorities. And you can think about distance in many different ways. So religion would be one of these forms, but ultimately is an empirical question and is a difficult question to answer and to answer carefully, because we don't have like sufficient data, like how many, I mean, those far there's like 60, I mean, now there's like 90 MPs who stem from a minority background, but how many of these are minorities and also Muslims? Very, very few. And so, I mean, empirically, it's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer.
There is a question, which I suppose is for Stephanie, by Theodoros Karapangios. Do you know how backlash policies, he's asking, such as the banning of veiling for Muslim women, I suppose in France, influence the attitude of both natives and immigrants? Is there research on that?
So the idea is that by imposing the banning of headscarves and so on, the dominant groups would kind of like feel more comfortable and perhaps express more positive attitudes towards immigrants. That's an interesting question. I haven't seen work specifically on that. What I have seen is work actually showing, I mean, it's a little bit different, but actually showing that when countries who are receptors of immigrants are protecting their borders, so say after Brexit in the UK, actually attitudes towards immigrants became much more positive. And there is also some research showing that after the construction of like border walls and so on, attitudes shifts in the sense that the dominant group members feel that now there is something that is being done in terms of regulating the inflow of immigrants into their countries, and so they express less exclusionary attitudes. This is some work of Omer Solodog, who shows that after protecting borders, attitudes shifts. I haven't seen in terms of kind of like what are the responses to like cultural assimilatory policies, but it's an interesting question that some graduate student can take.
Exactly. So we have a question about the fact that we haven't talked a lot. We talked about immigration from a perspective that kind of doesn't engage diaspora and transnationalism, and that has to do with the fact that, you know, you work on this topic from that perspective, and that's completely fine. I do work on diasporas, and so I'll just bracket to an extent Vahes Sahakian's question. I'm putting in the chat a special issue we've done with Alexandra Delano Alonso on diaspora politics and policy. Here, just to add that the question is about basically, and whether you want to add something, I presume in your case it would be a heterogeneity effect, so to speak, meaning the question is referring to how some diasporic communities may have more or less links or more or less, I guess, willingness to assimilate or willingness to integrate. And so that I presume in some of your studies may enter as a heterogeneity of the immigrant population factor. But obviously from a diaspora studies perspective, we often study how that heterogeneity emerges, or how states may be implicated, the origin states may be implicated in trying to slow down assimilation or expedite assimilation in some cases, actually, ironically or not, or at least integration. For example, Alexandra Delano's latest work from Here and There is showing how Mexican consulates were actually trying to help Mexican immigrants to further integrate, not necessarily assimilate, but definitely integrate in terms of paperwork and residency permits and so forth. So that's a very complex literature in the sense that it involves so many levels of analysis, and it should inform, I agree with the spirit of your comment, it should inform, I think, more immigration studies. But again, it's a process, and this field has been growing quite fast, but it hasn't been fully integrated with immigration studies. So I don't know if you want to add anything to this. I tried to address it on your behalf because it's closer to my interests, but yeah. So yeah,
I'll jump in quickly and just add a couple notes on that point. So one way that we do think about diasporas in immigrant integration studies is through the perspective of dual citizenship. Whether sending countries allow for dual citizenship and whether receiving countries allow for dual citizenship. So both the host and the destination have to allow for dual citizenship to enable the kind of integration outcomes that we're talking about. So I think it was almost like 46% of countries globally today offer dual citizenship in that dyad. This is recent work by Martin Fink, right? That you have both the origin and the destination states allow for dual citizenship. And so that just status acquisition in general, we know facilitates immigrant integration, and especially among communities that can obtain citizenship, hold dual citizenship, it further facilitates integration outcomes like the ones that Stephanie and I were both talking about. So on the one hand, that's kind of one dimension, one way in which we can study diasporas. The second is external voting. And on this, I would point to the work of Beth Wellman, who talks about how you can hold citizenship, live in the diaspora, and you can either experience de jure or de facto citizenship voting rights, but sometimes not both. So like you have the right as an external citizen to vote in your home country while living abroad, but there aren't voting booths open, right, to facilitate that voting, or there are other administrative barriers that prohibit your voting. So that's a second way in which we think about political participation, at least, but the experiences of diasporas is participating in the national political community back home.
Yeah, I'm posting some of the links. Also, Yossi Harpas has the Citizenship 2.0 book, and I'm going to put some of Beth's work. Now, for Stephanie, Felice, Aideen, don't you think there has to be a distinction between incorporation of immigrants and refugees? In particular for you, when you talk about ethnic minority candidates, do you look at which generation immigrants they are in? Can we make a distinction between diaspora members and new immigrants, for example? I guess he means established diaspora members. Something that came to my mind is the recent Syrian candidates were elected in Germany recently. I was wondering if that should be interpreted differently than candidacy of ethnic minorities whose families have been in the country for decades.
Yeah, so you can make that distinction. In the case of the UK, I think pretty much like 60% of the candidates that we were looking at are first generation immigrants, and like the rest are second generation immigrants. There were not many differences between these two, which speaks about how the native born may be perceiving ethnic minority communities. They, like dominant groups, might not be making these distinctions when it comes to sharing political resources with a group that might not that may be like in this hierarchical, like ethnic or racial order. It's assumed to be at the bottom, and so when it's perhaps trying to take some of your resources, you might react without making these distinctions. But yeah, as I respond to the other question, it's ultimately an empirical question that we could assess. We, again, did this type of analysis because of data limitations, but conceptually is something you can test. My answer would be, I don't think dominant group members are making these distinctions when it comes to sharing political power. I wanted to jump into the diaspora question, if I can go back to that. Another like fruitful area, perhaps not so much in political science, but on the side of sociology, is looking at the role of hometown organizations. So these are organizations that are funded by immigrants in their hometowns or home countries to try to help and develop their communities back home. And so here there is a relationship where more incorporated immigrants in their new countries that have perhaps access to more resources are also able to, through like remittances, you can think about these as capital remittances, but also social remittances. They're being able to like help develop their hometowns and in a way also incorporate their own communities into their home countries. These tends to be communities that are perhaps on the outskirts of the state. And so they're developing like public goods and so on that are coming from immigrant communities that are better incorporated. Of course, this creates like a series of issues and so on, but it's another fruitful area that can be developed when we're thinking of like diaspora.
And I would add, I mean, there is also, in a way, what I would call the more disturbing side that has come up obviously more recently, especially international security front. What Scott Radnitz and I wrote a whole book called Enemies Within, or edited volume, and we have a lot of examples. Not everybody who is targeted as a scapegoat or an enemy within is a diaspora or an immigrant group, but sometimes these communities are easily turned into that, and they're not the only ones by far. There are many domestic groups that are also targeted, indigenous, let's say, groups, but natives. But we find in that particular book that there is a pattern that elites do that. Politicians use this type of rhetoric primarily as a boundary-making mechanism, so to speak, to create coalitions that give them winning coalitions, so to speak. But there is also in international relations or international security literature, there is the other aspect that is more literally fifth column kind of politics. And sometimes diasporas are used as, or are often used as fodder or as, I guess, excuse to invade another country. We don't need to go back to Sudetenland, and when Hitler claimed he was going for the German diaspora there, right? But, we can look into what's going on in Ukraine and Russia's full-scale invasion. So this is another aspect that doesn't obviously fit with what we're talking in the first part of this, but it's related to the diaspora concerns and to an extent the dual nationality, which is often by some of these politicians and others discussed as dual loyalties rather than dual nationality. So that becomes a different type of issue, but I cannot not talk about it given I've dedicated a lot of years studying that aspect. But we have more time, so please send us more of your questions. Thank you, David. Any other questions that we have? Or Sara, do you want to address some other things that were left unaddressed? Jennifer has suggested a few more readings. We have Mia Basic for Stephanie. Could you please give us your opinion on Germany's recent decision on returning the immigrants to the EU countries where they entered the EU? I suppose that's Dublin too, right? That was where they first registered. For example, Croatia, what government or broader international law mechanism allows Germany to do so? I think that's part of Dublin, but I don't know if you've studied this more, Stephanie.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly the law aspect of it, like the international law and whose jurisdiction is this. So maybe Harris, you can chime in on that, or Sara.
Yeah, this is a very contested issue among European member states, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say this type of externalization of immigration policies are becoming very common, not only in Germany. We also have seen them in the UK, where they're sending back immigrants or make them wait in African countries. We see it here in the US. You can think about like the Remain in Mexico policy as similar to this one. So yeah, I was just going to say it's not only specifically to Germany.
Yeah, it's not there are two contested issues. Obviously, places like Italy, Spain, and Greece really don't like this idea that was a compromise reached. I don't know how much of a willing compromise it was in terms of countries of first entry that you're talking about. And then they were trying to push that, externalize it, as Stephanie said, even further by saying, well, what if the country where these people came from were actually considered safe countries, which means safe for refugees? Can we then push them back there? For example, Turkey. Is Turkey a safe country for Greece to push back people, right? In terms of their rights being respected and so on and so forth. So this is a very big discussion that it has less to do with actually policies for integration, but rather policies for not having immigrants or keeping them out of, or refugees for that matter, keeping them out of your territorial boundaries, so to speak. And they intensified this type of debates, obviously intensified after 2015. When there were big waves, especially of Syrian refugees coming to Europe. But it's an ongoing discussion. Sara, do you want to add something to that, or?
I can. I mean, they've been discussing the Dublin the regulations since the early 2010s. Is that how we refer to these decades now, right, really highlighted after 2015, and particularly in cases where people would try to evade getting fingerprinted upon entering the EU so that they could then go on to the interior, specifically Germany, right? So we were learning specifically about the sites in Greece and along the sort of border. But I would also point people to work by Kelsey Norman that talks about the externalization and what it means to be kind of a safe third country. She focuses on MENA, specifically North African countries, where you're observing sort of the infrastructure of the external border before people can even cross into the EU. And so she has a forthcoming book that looks specifically at those policies. But this is something, it's ongoing today. Like, parties across the aisle want comprehensive asylum reform, but the conversation is really being dominated at the moment because we're in election season by the far right, who set a different kind of immigration agenda, where, yes, the left in Germany wants to talk about these issues, but like that is not the electoral tone at the moment. Who wants another election? Who's hungry for more elections this year? We got a few.
Yeah. So yeah, this has been a very it's also a very important topic in terms of domestic politics, as you suggested, and especially many would say that in the Southern European, especially countries, were the first receiver countries, let's say. This has played quite intensely in the domestic politics. So the Five-Star Movement, the Salvini, Meloni, all of these people in Italy have played up this issue. Less so in Spain, actually. Interestingly, Spain, although it has actually more, I think, migration than Italy, it doesn't have as, it's not as salient in the political discourse. They have other issues, I guess, that dominate there, like Catalonia and Basque Country and all that.
Well, they've just been so successful in cutting off migration at this point, actually. If you look at migration flows, if you look at Frontex data, like Spain has been just very effective at fortifying that crossing. So like you don't see a lot of Western Mediterranean crossing at this point. So like
yeah, but I'm talking about during the financial crisis. When all these other things happened in other countries, Spain in a way didn't have it as prominent of an issue, which was surprising in a way because they did get a lot of migrants. In Greece, it did become an issue, and it was a very center stage issue, a political issue, I mean. And in Germany, it became, under Merkel, a huge issue. And now we're still living in the world of repercussions of that moment, I think, in the politics of Germany. But I also posted Kelsey's website where she's talking about, I think, Reluctant Reception is the book you were talking about?
She has a forthcoming book, Cambridge.
Another one. Is that, okay. So I don't know if she lists that, but
okay.
we can follow up. Yeah. Okay, so if we don't have, somebody asked us to address more generally, I guess, country biases in terms of migration or migration flows. In the US, there's a huge history, obviously, of the, Asian Exclusion Act and so on and so forth. So it's not that unknown that there are preferences from states, but is there, I guess that's not the type of work that is being done so much today in political science. This would be more historical work or policy work, maybe.
Stephanie?
Sorry, I lost track. I was like trying to fetch one article
so
talking about externalization policies in public support for them.
Great, thanks for sharing.
What was the?
Well, no, it was more me pondering about why we don't know more about contemporary bias, let's say. I mean, it's kind of out there in the open. It's not like it's not known. And there have been many books written about Islamophobia vis-a-vis the EU context and I'm sure there is a lot written, but in political science, I think we don't focus on these type of questions, I'm saying, so far, because they're at such an aggregate level and there's very little variation that it becomes hard to work on them and publish in mainstream journals, I think, with that type of argument.
Those are two very different.
Yeah.
Whether people research it and whether people can publish it are two extremely different questions.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah. But I don't know. What do you think, Sara? What are the reasons?
Well, so I will say, like, I think there is a lot of work on immigration attitudes in the United States. What comes to mind, one paper I wrote during the fever nightmare that was COVID was, me and my COVID co-authors, Shannon Guderian and Tom Popinski at the time, we were really curious about travel bans and whether they were tied to, for instance, people's real fears about COVID. So, do they want to express border closure against people where we saw high reporting of early COVID? So you think about how we talked about Italy in the news and how we saw China in the news and how we saw the UK in the news when they had their spikes versus their kind of racial attitudes, right, towards outsiders. And we saw that racial attitudes continued to dominate immigration preferences as opposed to sort of real COVID fears about transmission. And so, there are a lot of ways in which we can look at the question of who Americans prefer from the American perspective, right? Who people prefer in terms of like immigration. There's a lot of work about racial attitudes, how we think about attitudes towards unauthorized immigrants is mostly because how people think about who is an unauthorized immigrant, right? I mean, China has a huge population of unauthorized immigrants in the United States, but people don't think about China as in that category. They think about immigrants from Mexico writ large, i.e. anybody from south of here. So, there's a lot of work that's out there on immigration attitudes, generally speaking, but
yeah, I was talking more about state policy and assuming that attitudes of citizens affect state policy. Yes, we can say that, but sometimes states have their own reasons. And that's hard. That's what I was talking about. I think, yeah, you're right. A lot of work, and again, it may not get published in the top journals, as you said. That's a different issue, but there is work on that. Yeah, we do have 2 more questions, and we're getting closer towards the end. But again, Aideen is asking. How do immigrant incorporation and nationalism findings from Western Europe would compare to non-Western and or authoritarian contexts? Because we did focus mostly on democratic contexts or flawed democracies at least. It's a technical term. I've checked.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Stephanie, you had something or?
No, my immediate reaction was thinking which authoritarian countries are open to immigration. And so I couldn't think of many cases.
Well, there are many places that accept laborers, right? I mean, there is a huge Nura Lori and a lot on that. I can post her book.
Yeah, so we can talk about the United Arab Emirates, where exactly they would receive workers, but with no rights, no capacity to think about staying in the country for a long time, no capacity to bring their families and import their families to be together there, no political rights whatsoever, and so on. In many cases, their documents are retrieved, and so it's a form of modern exploitation of labor. You can think about this also. I don't know, Singapore. It's not necessarily an authoritarian country, but perhaps more close politically. But also, I think if we think of labor, migrants, these are very restrictive policies. I wouldn't even start thinking about integration because rights are quite limited and they're not being considered to stay more permanently in these countries. It's temporary work.
Yeah, I posted some more work on on the things that Sara suggested, that there is work. Nobody disputed that there's work on public attitudes towards migration. By the way, I was talking about understanding elite decisions, and I'm not someone who believes that public attitudes are enough to understand elite decisions. So that's why I still stand by my comment. Grant has another question. How easy is it? Oh, sorry. Oh, do you want to add something?
I want to jump in really fast to
Yeah.
two things. One, and I think the consensus is actually that elites can set public attitudes, right? That they sort of provide the discourse and the language, which then can allow attitudes to filter into sort of different
And
preferences.
Zahler's research also suggests
Right.
that. Yeah.
And then the second point is when I think about authoritarian, migration in an authoritarian context, and here I'm going to promote a colleague of mine, a junior colleague of mine. Samantha Bortherm's just published a book, Manipulating Authoritarian Citizenship, and it is about how China regulates its internal floating population, 200 million people through the household registration system, HUCO, so that which operates as a type of internal citizenship. It gives, it's not just the right to residence, but its employment rights and its healthcare and its access to education, and that is regulated within the national citizen population. And regulating access to cities for a rural population in and out. And so that's a very interesting sort of different way to think about integration, access to services, belonging in a authoritarian context where we don't associate it with political participation or rights per se.
Excellent. I also shared your book with on the pandemic, Sara, for those who, because you mentioned it. Last maybe question, unless something pops up. How easy is it for states with ethnoculturally based national identities like Germany or Poland to change their national identity to a thinner, civically based one like Canada has, since it was suggested earlier that this may help with incorporating immigrants, and that's one of the implications of our book also with Maya, by the way. We know with Darden, also Keith is also online, Darden, that national identities themselves are very durable, but how about the content of national identities? So meaning, could we change that without necessarily worrying about these durable gate-kept identities, as Darden would say? Yeah. Again, my student, so he's creating problems. Yeah.
Sara, you want to answer, and then I complement your answer.
That's like the $50,000 question, adjusting for inflation. Can Germany change their identity? I don't know. More people, have naturalized this. The SPD managed to get through their citizenship reform that they promised back in the late 90s. Before the government fell. So citizenship in Germany, lowering residency rates, or residency requirements, things like that. So on the one hand, citizenship is more attainable in Germany than ever before. On the other hand, the AfD has never done better politically. So whatever, people may be accessing citizenship and integrating in very meaningful ways at the local level and looking at local context. But then if we looked at top down, it takes a very different picture, and it shapes a very different story about what belonging in Germany means. And I just don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question, but I guess we tend to forget that policies are not only instrumental, but can also have a very important symbolic aspect to them, in the sense that by passing a specific policy, you would be redefining what national identity means. It might not mean something that is pegged to your blood and your grandparents' blood, but more about civic behavior. And so by promoting these policies, the government and the institutions are sending a message of how we are redefining ourselves and who we think we are now. And so, yeah, it's difficult to say, well, how this works top down, but potentially at the local level, you might see that some people do adopt this message of the policy redefining what a national identity might mean and is.
I will say that in my study in Germany, Harris posted the article previously, naturalized Germans are considered good citizens by a vast majority of people across the political spectrum, with the exception of the AfD. So it does suggest that, like, over time that this could be a normalized aspect of the German story, right? That naturalization is a pathway to German national belonging, and that, along with other civic obligations, naturalized Germans, are part of the national political community. And so maybe that portends a sign of change, or not. I don't know. I'm not a prognosticator.
Yeah. Well, this is a good time to invite back Zsuzsa, our leader of virtual ASN.
Thank you. One of the
I
things
want to thank first Stephanie and Sara on my behalf also for joining us and sharing a lot of their, insights and expertise.
Because I'm in panelist status here, I wasn't able to type in a question in Q&A, and I wanted to bring up something that I have been thinking about as you were talking. It's is the question of whether anti-newcomer attitudes are really mostly or primarily about national identity, right? So I study minorities, state, majority minority relations, and nativism anti-newcomer attitudes are just as prevalent among the non-majority, non-mainstream population. And so I was thinking that sometimes maybe it's just a lazy way for us to say that it has to do with this nationness and national identity. But I don't know whether it's laziness to say it's about nativism, because what's the temporal moment where nativism begins? So it's probably a little bit more complicated. And I'm sure it has all kinds of elements of racism, and this Brubaker had an article some years ago about civilizationism, how anti-immigrant attitudes in the European Union had to do with civilizationism, which could be a code word for racism. So it has this complexity that is not necessarily always about a shared national identity. The Germans may not be anti-newcomer for the same reason. So those who are surveyed for the same reason, and the same for other populations. So I was just thinking, I don't know how that can be researched, studied, explored, the complexity of that.
Yeah.
If you have any thoughts on that, I would be thankful.
Yeah, I mean, my general take on this sort of question of, like, where do we place the boundary of who's a native, who's not a native, and why are they responding to immigrants or newcomers? My general take is we usually see people responding to sort of like material, like competition for material resources, being like whatever social, political, economic resources. And then we have the elites manipulating the fact that there is this like reaction to competition for resources. And the elites are manipulating it not necessarily as it is in this instrumental way. Yes, you're competing for jobs, you're competing for housing. Instead, elites are manipulating the narrative in terms of identities. And so perhaps the elites are those who are contributing to place these boundaries, right? And we saw it being played right now with Trump going to places that were majoritarily Latino and talking about newcomers as these are a threat for you. These people who potentially your grandparents grew up with, their grandparents are now different to you, and they are threatening, they are a threat to you. And so this is where elites start marking these, who belongs, who doesn't, who's a real native, even though you might be a second generation immigrant from Mexico and so on. But I think like instrumentally, that this threat is coming from like competition for its different resources. And then we have elites manipulating the boundaries of belonging in these different ways that operate for their political careers.
I mean, I think this is a really kind of interesting site of research at the current political moment, where a lot of pollsters, but also political scientists are looking at, like, for instance, the self-identified Hispanics that voted for Trump, right? You had, what, 46%? I don't remember these days, something like that, right? Okay, so, a lot of kind of the early work is like, well, why would they vote for someone who is ostensibly anti-immigrant? And like one of the findings is they don't identify themselves as immigrants anymore, right? That they, you often see this is sort of a study, a finding that's corroborated in the literature, which is that, immigrants, when they successfully integrate, they don't see themselves as sort of being weighted down by that immigrant heritage or that identity. And they too value law and order. They too value the things, the political and social dynamics that we hope that people who integrate obtain. And so sometimes that includes anti-outgroup attitudes, right? So,
Yeah.
double-edged sword, right?
Right.
There's also the reverse that we didn't cover, reverse discussion on the other side of this coin. Once immigrant communities or diaspora communities, to go back to an earlier comment, stay in a country long enough, sometimes they start wanting to be recognized as minorities.
Yeah.
And then the line, not between natives and immigrants, but the line between minorities that are indigenous, like you came from one of those, Zsuzsa.
Yeah.
How do you draw a line between indigenous, so to speak, minority and a new minority, right?
Of course,
And
the indigeneity concept again intervenes because that's a different category, but I use homeland minorities, but it's
no, but I'm saying, but that's a huge debate, as you know, in the Council of Europe, and what is the framework that would we be guided by that or not?
Yep.
Somebody says this is especially relevant in the post-Soviet space.
Yeah.
Kyle,
Not only, yeah, wherever borders changed and more traditional minorities remained in place, persistent minorities. Yep. But
Stephanie,
anyway,
we're going to jump in.
Sorry.
Stephanie, you
Yeah,
want?
Oh, yeah, no, I was thinking about what you said, and yeah, I with research among Latinos, we see it's the natural process of incorporation that leads to these shifts in partisanship or like vote choice and so on. It's just a process of incorporation. Perhaps also voters become more sophisticated, like at some point they might only care about immigration. Now when you ask them, like, what do you care about, they don't think about immigration as an issue that affects them, and perhaps like the first thing that they think about is the economy. And so if you have someone like Trump talking about, I'm going to make this economy great again because this is what we all want, and linking the economic issues, inflation and so on, to the presence of immigrants, you will naturally see minority groups, even Latinos or even like Asian Americans as well, supporting this candidate, even though he might be a nativist. And so it's part of the process of immigrant incorporation. People become more sophisticated in how they make decisions about who to vote for and what are the issues that they care about.
And already we're making very clear that the word minority is used so different in the US context and in the European one, because if you wanted to use your terms, use a homeland minority, well, all of them, what is a homeland? All of us are homeland minorities here in a way, or not homeland minority, right? So it's very confusing if you start crossing the pond. Yeah.
So,
but we all know what we mean, but a third party will be confused by some of these uses across the two contexts. Yeah,
that's right. So, on the Stephanie's happy note, optimistic note about people becoming more sophisticated and voters becoming more sophisticated. Let's hope that will be the reason in the future. I mean, the case in the future. So thank you very much, Stephanie and Sarah and Harris, obviously. And I'd like to also thank Lisa and Lucina for a lot of work behind these webinars. And thank you everyone who came out and stayed with us. And I want to remind everyone that we are archiving these conversations and they can be downloaded. Go check out the virtual ASN website. You will see all kinds of really interesting webinars archived on larger questions, more specific questions, and also some conversations about methodology and such. And we will continue offering those, and I hope to see you guys back. Take care.